Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience. There are a little bit of technical issues here, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Jesse. I'm a friend of Belmont Books. Belmont Books, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up, including our book club, which is reading The Office of Historical Corrections on Monday, and Kimmery Martin discussing her new book, Doctors and Friends, with Susan Coven on Tuesday. You can register for these and our other events on our website, belmontbooks.com, which is also where you can purchase tonight's book, Power in the Blood. If you have any questions for the authors, please type them in the Q&A section, and we'll get to as many as we can. We're very excited to welcome Hiawatha and Paul, and I want to let you know a little bit about them, and then I'll turn the event over to them. Excuse me. Hiawatha Bray is an award-winning technology reporter and columnist for the Boston Globe. His writing has also appeared in Wired, Fast Company, Black Enterprise, and Christianity Today magazine. He received an Overseas Press Club Award for his series on the Internet in Africa. Hiawatha is the author of You Are Here, From the Compass to GPS, The History and Future of How We Find Ourselves, A History of Modern Navigation. Power in the Blood, which comes out on Wednesday, is his first novel. Hiawatha is also a deacon at People's Baptist Church of Boston, one of the nation's oldest African-American congregations, and he is an aspiring wine connoisseur. Born in Chicago, he lives in the suburbs of Boston with his wife and 3 children. Paul Makishima is a former book editor of the Boston Globe. In addition to covering books, he has also been an editor in business, Metro, and national news, and a page 1 editor at the Globe, Quincy Patriot Ledger, and Raleigh News and Observer. Paul currently works as an editor at the Harvard Gazette and lives in Boston. Gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for doing this. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right, glad to be here. Wonderful. I hope people can see us here. Whoa. Oh, there we go. I see that changed what appeared on the screen, but we're good. Okay, well, it's been a pleasure here to get a chance to reconnect with Paul because we used to work together at the Globe, and I harass him all the time and come over there demanding free books. But he's really a very thoughtful, insightful guy, far too intelligent to hang around with the likes of me. And we're going to sit here and talk about, well, the book and how it was that a Black journalist in Boston decided to write a book about a Black journalist in Boston. So what would you like to ask?
Well, you began with it, really, because the million-dollar question is that here you are, a longtime newspaper reporter and the author of You're Here, a nonfiction book. And now all of a sudden you've got this novel and a mystery, no less. And we're curious about it. I'm sure that a lot of the folks out there are curious to know what made you decide to do this, or if you're just sort of piggybacking along with this current trend of folks like Bill Clinton and Stacey Abrams, celebrities who jump into the mystery genre.
But yeah, I'm a celebrity, sure.
What made you decide to do this?
Oh, it's just that I had the ideas kicking around in my head for years, just as I have a number of other fiction ideas kicking around in my head. I wanted to do it. It was, well, I don't know how to describe it. I have a bunch of ideas in my head for stories that have nothing to do with necessarily the real world, but they give me a chance to get at ideas and questions and problems that are often on my mind about all kinds of things, ranging from technology to religion to politics to human relationships. There are so many things that that I would love to talk about, and this is an opportunity to do it. And yeah, I know we're supposed to hold off on the questions, but I just saw that question pop up on the screen. Do I see this as part of a series? Yes, I do. And some of the oddities about what is contained in this book is partly due to the fact that what I really started out thinking about, and this is going to be kind of weird here, what really got me thinking was this combination of African-American history and Isaac Asimov. I haven't seen it yet, but there's a TV series that just kicked off based on Asimov's most famous, I guess his most famous stuff is I, Robot, but the other thing he wrote that is extremely famous is a series of books called Foundation. And Foundation, of course, is about this idea of this, this high priesthood almost of science that can predict the future and tries to reshape human destiny by intervening in certain correct moments. And I started thinking about that and thinking to myself, why can't Black people do that? And I thought, why not Black people intervening in history and tilting the course of history at crucial moments? And that is one of the ideas that makes its way into the book. And this book sort of taps into that. And there's a wonderful moment in the book, at least it was wonderful for me, where the hero, Weldon Drake, is introduced to the fact that this institution exists. And my favorite part is where one of the older members starts talking about the assassination attempts on Martin Luther King that you've never heard about because they stopped them. And I'm sitting here going, oh, there's the next book right there. Because one of the reasons I came up with this is that this could be a wonderful way of retelling sort of an alternate history of Black America from the standpoint of this organization founded during the Reconstruction period. Probably after the corrupt bargain that took federal troops out of the South when lynch mobs and everything explode. And that's when this organization starts. And ever since they've been quietly fiddling with American history here and there in unexpected ways. And I saw this as an opportunity to tap into that while at the same time telling a story set in modern times. But several of the ideas that I have and that I touch on in the book very briefly could be turned at some point in the future into stories with an entirely different set of characters, but built around the same thing. Sort of like what Asimov does in Foundation, which spans like 1,000 years. And so you have different characters still working within this concept of the Foundation. I obviously toy around with the assassination attempts on Martin Luther King. There are a number of other ideas. I mentioned possibly the idea of, do we whack Hitler at the 1936 Olympics? First time we could get a Black guy close enough. And I'm sitting here thinking, ooh, that could work.
But let me ask you this. So, because I'm curious about, you've talked a little bit about the genesis of this thing. So, it's interesting because again, this it's a novel, and like many novels, there are all kinds of little historical threads and factoids in this thing. So, when you're thinking about this story, you're beginning to think about the story. Does it begin with this group of folks who get together, who are sort of pulling strings in the background? Is that where it begins for you? The reason I ask that is because I'm just curious about that. For different writers, Faulkner once said that one of his most famous books, I think it was As I Lay Dying. No, not As I Lay Dying. I'm sorry. It's not. I can't remember exactly which one, but he was talking about how he began this book with an image in his mind of a boy who has climbed out of his bedroom window onto a tree and is describing for other kids who are back in the house behind that window. He's describing the scene he can see below the tree, and the scene is the scene of his mother's funeral. So, and none of that stuff ended up making its way into the book, but that's what it began with. So for you, it began with this idea of this group. Is that where it began?
No, that is such a great anecdote, because yes, that's something like what happened to me. Very different though. I had no idea where it was going to go. I had already been kicking around this Foundation-like idea, but what really popped into my head that got me started writing this is sort of similar to what you did. There's this image that kept popping into my mind. I had this image. Well, there are a couple of images, actually. There are 2 or 3 of them. Well, I'll start with the first one. The first one is you go to a church, my church, which happens to be People's, and somebody has trashed the church completely. And in the original image, there was no death or blood or anything, but somebody has come in and completely vandalized the church. And in the midst of the wreckage, someone has left a message, like a note, scrawled on a piece of paper or something. And the note read, "Stop sinning or something worse will happen to you." That's a quote from Jesus, by the way. And I sat there thinking about that. What would that be like? What if somebody attacked a church and left a message like that? What would it mean? And it ends up not at all being what I ended up writing, but it got me thinking about what form would evil take inside this church? What kind of corruption might settle there? And then I started thinking about the foundation thing, and it all started to tie together. And at some point, I had to come up with an almost deus ex machina thing to have a lot of stuff happen. And I realized that this foundation is part of it, but also is a character that I really think could be, and he plays a major role in this, which is a black tech billionaire, which is something I don't think we've got yet. We've got some pretty prominent black tech executives, but we don't have like a giant black tech billionaire. And I plug him in here. And he is going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting, I think, in future volumes, and including at some point, he's got to fly his Lockheed Constellation, because I'm really, I mentioned just in passing that he owns a Lockheed Constellation and flies it himself. And do you know what a Lockheed Constellation is?
I have no idea, but I
Oh
assume that I know that you do.
I'm sorry, it's not an important aspect of the book, but I always am amazed that people aren't as thrilled as I am by stuff like that. I shouldn't say this, perhaps. The Lockheed Constellation, go look it up in Google and look at a picture of it. It is basically sex with wings. It is the most gorgeous airplane ever engineered. It is the pinnacle of piston aircraft design. It is so physically beautiful that every time I look at it, I just go, ooh. So I'm sorry, I'm just into Lockheed Constellations. And at some point, I've got to work one into the book. In any case, into the books.
I know that's okay. I think that anyone who's watching this is probably having a good time playing around in their own minds with the takeoff and the landing jokes.
Yeah, well, if you read the book, you'll notice that one of the things that the character does is he has memorized the takeoff procedures for a Boeing 737.
Right.
And I write about that in the book. And I haven't memorized them, but this is something I actually do. You can go on, there's this great video on YouTube, from cold and dark to ready to roll. Somebody who is actually a pilot shows you everything you do to turn on a jet line. And I love watching stuff like that. It's so cool. And I worked that into the book because he is the kind of character who draws strength and sustenance and relaxation from the logical, the rigorous, the predictable. That's the kind of person he is. We haven't talked much about the character, and it's really important because he's in some ways a really bad person. But to me, the character of Weldon Drake is a crucially important character because it gives me a chance to play with ideas that I really worry about. And now we're getting into my religious beliefs. I'm a Christian, and he is a Christian.
Hold on, yeah. Let's back you up though. Let's. I want to back you up just a minute because I want to talk about Weldon, but just your idea about how you construct this character. So, if there are a lot of mystery fans out there, one of the things about many very good mysteries, besides all the intricate plotting and the stories and whatnot, that typically the person who is at the center of these mysteries, besides having to solve these things and having to juggle two or three sort of balls in the story, the plot lines going around, typically they're also having to deal with something personal, with some personal aspect that complicates things, that's apart from whatever professional problems they're having. And it's interesting because this character is one who has given him as somebody who has trouble reading social cues. In fact, at some point later, he doesn't completely understand. Tells us that he lacks a certain amount of empathy, although in the course of the book that certainly turns out to be not true. And at some point, I believe he himself describes himself or has described himself to friends and thinks of himself as kind of a sociopath. And so that's a really interesting character flaw for the character to have. What made you decide on that one? Why that?
Well, I can tell you one thing. it was relatively late in the process. I had written much of the book, and I decided, no, this guy is heartless. And that suddenly, I think, made the character open up for me. And I think it's partly because, well, I'm not heartless, but I'm often clueless. I'm not a sociopath, but I do sometimes have trouble reading people. And so I thought to myself, if you're going to make this character in any way like you, why not pick out one of your most interesting character flaws and plug it into him and then make it, and then turn it up to 11. It just seemed, and why that is so appealing to me, again, is because of his religious beliefs, because he is convinced that there's something about that makes him unworthy and ungodly, because he takes very seriously that's what I don't know how to describe it. Imagine somebody who is unemotional, but who really believes all this stuff about loving God and loving your neighbor. He doesn't do it, but he believes he's supposed to, and he really, really tries, but he's just not very good at it. And so his way of dealing with that, and has been his way of dealing with emotions and feelings for his entire life, is basically to read people, to figure out what they would expect him to feel, and then just project that. Like, you know, when people are grieving over the attack at the church, he doesn't feel that same sense of grief, but he knows how to project that sense of grief, because as a church deacon, he has this duty to demonstrate empathy, and he tries it. And the tendency is to think of him as a hypocrite. And I suppose maybe on some level he is, but he's not really. He's really trying to be a good person by demonstrating the love and care that he's supposed to demonstrate. But in his heart, he's actually a very cold-hearted person. And he's trying to learn to be good. It's like Pinocchio wanting to learn to be a real boy. And which is funny because I just finished reading Pinocchio to my son. Oh, it's a great book. And so to me, delving into that is really all about, I mean, I know a lot of people don't necessarily read books like this looking for religious content, and the book is not, I hope, at all religiously preachy. But to me, this is a character who's trying to figure out how to live a good, godly life when he thinks that he has this chain around him that he thinks is keeping him from being a good person. And it's so much a part of his personality that he can't see any way of getting free of it. He's just cold. He's just cold. Yeah.
That's why I wanted to talk about him before we got to this other stuff, because clearly this book it's a lot throughout. It's got a lot to do with the idea of sin and redemption, and this guy sort of struggling with all of that, and even sort of it's interesting because as you say, he has trouble reading signals. He thinks of himself in terms of somebody who can't really identify with other people and doesn't have much empathy. So how does this guy do it? And at some point, he sort of suggests that he does it almost through a kind of rote that he refers to as sort of a sense of duty.
Yeah.
That at some point he talks about how it's not a love of God, it's not a fear of God, it's not these emotions that he's interested in. It's certainly not any kind of sort of esoteric understanding or ideas of philosophical ideas about a God principle, but it's a matter of sort of belief and duty.
It's almost stoicism. It's almost a sort of Christian stoicism, where he's basically saying, this is like a Marcus Aurelius who would say, this is your duty, just go do it. And that is your role in life, is to do your duty and then just see what happens. And that's the kind of person he is. And there's a sneaking part of him that wonders if he isn't, in some sense, ultimately damned because of that. And, you know, that he will never really be a good person, because on some level, he wants to be a good person, because for him, goodness is about order and everything making sense and everything being in its place. And he knows on some level it's got to be about more than that. it's like he read these things out of the Bible and just made up his mind to believe them. And now he's absolutely convinced that he must do as he has been told. And the one part he can't do is the part that's supposed to ultimately come naturally, but it doesn't come naturally to him at all.
Yeah, there was some other thing that I was curious about that I really wanted to ask you about,
Yeah,
because
sure.
there are times that in the book that there's sort of allusions that kind of bubble up to him having some darkness in his past, and even at one point he talks about wanting to he had this fantasy of killing his father,
Yeah.
but it was never quite clear to me whether or not there actually was something that he did, or whether this is a kind of, or what passes for a kind of guilt over sins that are either imagined or that he can't wrap his hands about whether or not these things are sins or not, whether he actually did something or whether he just feels like there is darkness in him. It was not quite clear to me.
We know he didn't do it.
Right.
Yeah, I know he didn't do it. But the point is, yeah, that you're saying you're not sure. That's exactly the point. I don't want everything to be clear, and not just for purposes of a future sequel, although there will, oh dear. Should I talk about that? Stuff I've got in mind for future books.
Sure.
You know his ex-wife is now in Nigeria. That comes out at some point.
Right.
The plan is for him to end up there too. And interesting complications will result. But some of that stuff is laying, a lot of the stuff you're looking at, which goes, well, I'm not clear about this. I'm laying the groundwork for future books in the series. And some of that is stuff that's going to be explained in the future, and other stuff is not. Although, I don't know, I'm going through a real period of temptation right now, and I should pray about it, because there's a part of me that wants to stop and hold off on writing the next book, because an idea for another book has hit me that is just so brilliant that I keep thinking I should do that one first. Ever see the Alfred Hitchcock movie Foreign Correspondent?
Yes.
I call it the best Hitchcock movie most people have never heard of. Now, this one, again, it's very simple, obvious story. This time, the Foreign Correspondent is a Black journalist. But the point is, of course, he's a Black journalist in 1940. He's a Black journalist in 1940. He works for, say, the Chicago Defender or the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the great Black American newspapers. And you remember the plot of Foreign Correspondent, right? Mm-hmm. He finds the most naive, ignorant reporter he can and says, go over to Europe and cover what's going on over there. Do the same thing with a Black guy who's used to covering, like, Ku Klux Klan rallies or something, and send him over there. You could do great stuff with that. And I really would like to get around to that one of these days, but I think I may have to write book 2 of this first. And book 2 is going to be about a lot of this stuff, the further adventures of this. It might have a romantic subplot, it might not. And it's going to feature, I think, this idea of what a Black alt-right church might look like. That's the idea I'm playing around with right now and trying to figure out how to make it work, because I think that's less far-fetched than a lot of people might think. And you could have a lot of fun with that. And that's what I think is going to end up happening. I want to write it fast, though, because I don't have an infinite amount of time to become a world-famous novelist. So I've got to start banging. I worked on this for years, and I don't want to work on the next one for years. I want it to take about a year or so.
What I'd like to talk to you, to move off this and talk a little bit about race, because I thought that there are a lot of really fascinating things about race in this book. I mean, one of them is that it moves primarily in the Black community and also in the subculture of hackers, but it's interesting because it gives us also sort of a look at white culture from the vantage of Black culture. And in fact, there's a little bit of a, particularly these days, there's folks sort of trying to wrap their hands around privilege and the idea of privilege. I think that even in one of the first lines in the book, the book opens on a subway train, and Weldon witnesses this young woman being hit, and he describes her right away as a plump white girl in shorts and a tank top. And the guy who did this is a thin, brutish white man in a Boston Celtics jersey. And so if you're a careful reader, what occurs to you right away is that the speaker is not white.
Mhm.
Because if it was a white person, you would never get that descriptive feature.
Yeah,
So that
that's
tells
true.
you, yes, that tells you already that this is a world that you're inhabiting. And that it's interesting too, because within this world, I mean, it's Black culture, but it's specifically the Black church. But there's this really interesting conversation that's going on that threads its way throughout the book. I mean, you get little bits of it here and there. It figures most prominently when you have this group of church deacons who are sort of potentially pulling strings in the background. At some point, they sort of have this conversation among themselves, and they're sort of asking this question about how much progress has really been made. You know, are we in a post-racial society? And then sprinkled throughout the book, there are little bits and pieces about mass incarceration and about income inequity. And it's a conversation that never quite gets resolved, but it's always there.
Mhm.
Is that something you thought about? Were you
Oh, yeah,
trying to
sure.
that was part of it?
Sure, sure, sure. I happen to be a glass half full kind of guy about race in America. I'm a little worried, I think, about the 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 simmering notion that America is this place that hasn't improved much since, I don't know, the era of Jim Crow, which I think is just, sorry, I think that's nuts. I know my parents were from the Deep South and grew up in a Jim Crow world. I'm a product of the Great Migration. They got out of there and moved to Chicago, and that has, as the poem goes, that has made all the difference. That and the changes in American culture. Uh, that said, yeah, we still live in a society in which race clearly is of great significance. But I love the way you went back to that whole idea of the meeting of the deacons, because some of them are more like me, thinking, things have improved dramatically. And others are more like, no, we haven't gotten anywhere yet.
Mhm.
And this whole argument about what the future of their organization ought to be because one of them is saying, we're not really needed to do the stuff we used to do, like keep Martin Luther King alive or preventing lynchings or something like that. And the other person says, oh, yes, we're still needed because cops are still out there killing Black people and so forth. And we're going to work through that in the course of, I hope, other books in the series. And I hope to go back in time and look at some of these historical events and try to, like for example, we need to do one book at the very least on how this organization first came into being and who originally founded it and all. And I could have all kinds of fun with that. But yeah, it's an argument that is going to go on and on and on. I got to tell you, I grew up in the heart of the civil rights movement, and I still think that the end goal is supposed to be a world in which we don't care about race at all. And that has become, it's a fascinating thing to have lived through this and seen this. That has become now regarded as a reactionary, and some people would even say a racist point of view. And I think that's bizarre. One of the things we often hear, and I think quite rightly, is that race as we talk about it is a ridiculous concept. It doesn't have any real meaning. It's all something that was ginned up culturally to excuse and justify slavery. So then you, having reached that conclusion, you say, oh, well, fine, then let's just start acting as though race doesn't matter. And the minute you say that, they say, how dare you say race doesn't matter? What are you, some kind of believer in white supremacy or something? I think that's bizarre. Even if you don't agree that that is the end state we should reach, it seems to me it's a reasonable and healthy goal. And it took a lot of people's blood and sweat and effort to get us to the point where white people were basically saying, blackness, being Black doesn't matter. You should be able to live as a free person in a free country. And now we're going through a period in which people are actually saying that if you pretend to be colorblind, that just proves you're a racist. It doesn't make any sense to me. I look at it and I think, that's progress. Why are you messing with that? That's a good thing. And I'm sort of out of step with a lot of people that talk about this, because I'm really worried that we're dividing our country by race in ways that are simply unnecessary and bound to be unprofitable. But that doesn't mean I don't want to talk about race, because race is really interesting, and mainly because it has so many goofy, weird ideas associated with it in our minds, in the minds of so many people.
Well, again, I thought it was interesting because this is about the main character is somebody who obviously lives in a white world, but is most comfortable in this other world, the world of the Black church. But in addition, is equally comfortable in this other subculture of hackers.
Yeah.
And it's clear that there's all kinds of and this is in fact a culture. I mean, it's clear it's a culture because there are, besides it's got its own language, but it's even clear in your discussion of it that there are certain kinds of sort of moral and ethical systems that exist in this culture that don't always quite sync up with what it is that people on the outside might think of. For instance, these guys think, well, okay, fine, so we can hack a bank, and we're not going to, we don't want to, it would be a bad thing if we brought down the whole banking system. But if there's some bank out there that we either don't like or don't have any respect for, or don't have any respect for their systems, and we hack it, and if we take a little bit of money, the FDIC will cover it, and so that's fine, as long as we don't hurt anybody.
Yeah.
And that seems to be, again, it's interesting to me that you have this character that I guess understands and is so conversant in this idea, is comfortable with this idea of living in a subculture and being part of it.
Well, we all live in subcultures, and just as there are multiple Black subcultures, there are multiple tech subcultures, and so on. And we all live in those subcultures. And I don't claim to be experts in any of them. One of my problems is, and I think it's part of what happens, I'm the kind of writer who looks at things from a somewhat of a distance and looks in and tells you what I see going on in there. I do partake, it's weird because I am in the Black church, but I wasn't always. I have gone to a bewildering variety of churches in my life, starting out with the Roman Catholic Church in which I was raised as a child, and I often thank God for it. I mean, there's something about being brought up Catholic that's just indelible and delightful in a way that you look at Protestant churches and they just don't quite have it. But yeah, but that culture is really such a blessing to have. But also, yes, I've dabbled in now robotic culture and software culture, and there are all kinds of cultures that I've been a part of, and I'm always a little distant. And that, I guess, is the Weldon Drake character. Again, I always look at things and I step back, and I want to step back. I think it's a virtue to be able to step back and say, why is he doing that? And it drives people crazy when they talk to me sometimes. They don't understand why I just don't want to get too head up about things, and instead look at something and go, no, just let's think about this for a minute. Why is he doing that? And that's the way I approach all of these cultures, including my own. And so I often find myself out of step with people in various ways because I try not to be. I don't want to be that guy who just dives in and just goes with the flow. I want to always be the guy that's stepping out there and going, I don't know, why is he doing that? Because I think that's part of the character traits that, well, I don't know, for example, maybe they kept me out of prison or something, because seriously. And it's like I tell I'm reading in Pinocchio, and I'm saying, and I just realized as I'm reading my son Pinocchio, I take for granted that Pinocchio was some kind of a fool, but there are probably people who are reading the story and go, oh, I'm like Pinocchio. I want to just go try new things. I just can't help wanting to dive in and do what my friends tell me to do. And I'm always the guy who's like the fairy or the cricket standing back going, now, wait a minute, does that make sense? And that's the way I approach almost everything in life. And I grew up watching Star Trek. My hero was Mr. Spock, and that's all you need to know. I just go, Let's just think about this here.
It makes you temperamentally a journalist too.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. That's how
So I've got to ask one more question though. One last question, because I know we're running out of time. There's actually a good bit of eating that goes on in this book, both in the church and outside the church. And so I have to ask us, are you as deeply enamored with bacon, sausage, eggs, biscuits, and grits as it might seem?
absolutely. Who isn't? That's American food. That's Black people food. And when you get it at church, it's made by genuine Black people for that genuine Black people flavor. And yeah, our church before the pandemic, they would serve bacon and grits and the worst coffee on earth. It was frightening how bad the coffee was. Yeah, all of that is absolutely real. And we will occasionally let white people in and they can eat it. And it will be, no, we don't do stuff like that, of course. And it's wonderful. And yeah, and Serdix flights, by the way, which I mentioned at one point during a stopover in Minneapolis. Serdix flights is a real place. It is a wine bar at the Minneapolis airport where you can just go get some charcuterie and a nice glass of wine and sit there and wait for your flight. It's wonderful.
So I'm going to interrupt because we have a couple questions from folks who've been listening.
Mhm.
And the first one is from Rosemary, who
Oh,
asks,
no. It's my sister, I think.
all right, well,
No,
this
come
says,
on.
is there any sense that he might be autistic? You describe someone who might have Asperger's.
No, actually, that didn't occur to me. I figure you don't have to have Asperger's to be a jerk. This guy, he really has to work hard at not being a jerk. But I don't think, no, just no. I never even thought about it, as a matter of fact. And as I said before, I don't know if she was here for this, I didn't come to that idea until the book was like 2/3 written. And I said, you know what this guy needs to be? A sociopath or close to it. Yeah. And that's when it occurred to me. And it really made it, I think, a lot more resonant. And it's going to be even more resonant because at some point, I think we're going to marry him off. I think we're going to marry him off, and it's going to be a very troubled marriage. Not fatally, I think, but in some really interesting ways. And there will be a child involved. But never mind. You can see where we're going possibly. But go ahead. What's the next question?
We have another question from Catherine, who asks, how much do you rewrite?
Oh, a lot, tons. One of the cool things that happened, I had it finished, right? And then I was reading, I was listening to an audiobook. I was listening to Elmore Leonard's Freaky Deaky. I have not read enough Elmore Leonard. I have read a little. And I was just in awe of the efficiency of Elmore Leonard's writing. And not only that, but I'm sitting there listening to this. This is actually just about 8 or 9 months ago. And I'm listening to this, and for some reason, a line that I had read, Elmore Leonard has written a bunch about how to write. And I remember here, it suddenly just popped into my head, a line by Elmore Leonard about how to write. And the line was, leave out the parts that people don't read. And I heard that, and it just like a penny dropped. I went in, I cut like 5,000 words. I went through that book and I found every part where I thought to myself, if you were reading this book for the first time, would you want to read that? And I said, nope, that's gone, that's gone, that's gone. And I tore like 5,000 words out of it just by following Elmore Leonard's advice. Leave out the parts that people won't read. And that is one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard. And by the way, when you write for a newspaper, I felt stupid for not having done it before, because that's exactly the sensibility you bring to mind. Or as I often say, I've never seen a 1,000-word story that isn't better as a 700-word story. You can always make the story better by hacking stuff out. Absolutely. And I really hope, I think I've done that. I tried to kill everything. Another one of my favorite writers is, certainly my favorite thriller writers is Richard Stark. You know Richard Stark, right? All right, let's try, Donald Westlake.
Yes.
He's Richard Stark. Donald Westlake made his name writing comic thrillers. And then one day in the early 60s, he decided he wanted to go in an entirely different direction. He used the pen name Richard Stark, and he started writing these thrillers about a guy named Parker, who was a master thief. Let me put it to you this way. The Parker books are now being reprinted by the University of Chicago Press. They're that good. They are masterpieces of crime writing. And almost every one of them is no more than about 220 pages long. You can read them in 1 or 2 sittings. They are magical. And I love those books. And I said, I want to write like Stark writing about Parker. Just nothing, but just total pow, but not as violent.
We have a question from Janine. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right.
Oh my goodness, is that another relative?
This complex character seems to be teetering on making good choices versus bad choices. What are his triggers?
I don't know. Despite his lack of emotion, there is a certain amount of, he definitely has some rage at times. And he is angered by, he doesn't, it has nothing to do with caring about people. He is angered about he is angered by the irrational and the unjust and the cruel. And it's not because he cares so much about people, as he just thinks it's wrong to be that way. And he has to do something about it. And it's, you know, it's almost like, it's like the line from the Maltese Falcon, you know, when somebody kills your partner, you have to do something about it. It doesn't matter whether he was a bum. It doesn't matter whether you liked him. He was your partner and you do something about it. Now, every bogey fan knows that. And he's sort of like that too. You do something about it because it is wrong and you have to stand up for the right. And that's one of his triggers there. But at the end of the day, it's not that much about caring about people. You know, at some point, he ends up being involved in something really bad happening to somebody and is shocked by his own realization that he doesn't care. That's to me, a key moment. I'm not going to give away too much, but just saying that this is a guy who has tried to do the right thing and tried to do the right thing and tried to do the right thing. And at the end of the day, he realizes that he's trying to do the right thing. It's not a fake, he really is. But if doing the right thing causes others to suffer, he doesn't care. He really doesn't care. And that part of him, the part that he carries through life almost like a cross, is still there. And it just, he can't help it.
Well, we certainly want to thank both of you. That was an interesting and exciting conversation. I want to let folks know that they can get the book at Belmont Books, and we put up the link to that. And I want to thank everyone for coming tonight.
Oh,
Any last words before we say goodnight?
No, buy the book. And, yeah, and I'm going to keep at it because I think I have lots of other things to say. I want to write about this. I want to write about Foreign Correspondent. I also have a wonderful idea for a book set in Stalinist Russia that I want to get around to. There are a million ideas I've got floating around, and I've got now a wonderful excuse to do it because I've written a novel. And the great thing about writing a novel is that once you've done it, you know you can write a novel.
Great note, and thank you both. And have a very good evening and weekend.
Will do. Thanks a lot.